So Véronique Tadjo is a writer, an academic, and an artist, and a painter. She was born in Paris, grew up in Abidjan in Ivory Coast. She earned a BA in English from the University of Abidjan and a doctorate from the Sorbonne in Paris in African American literature and civilization. In 1979, she first started to teach English at a high school in Korogo in northern Ivory Coast. In '83, she went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. on a Fulbright research scholarship before she continued teaching then at the English department of the University of Abidjan in Ivory Coast until '93, when she took up writing full-time. She also then began writing and illustrating books for children from '88 onwards, and her first book, Lord of the Dance, an African retelling, was awarded, no, it was Mami Wata, sorry, the second book, Mami Wata and the Monster, won the UNICEF award in '93. And most of them, 8 of them, are actually also in bilingual editions. And I think this is also a very important point when we talk about care and responsibility. I mean, one aspect we haven't approached yet, but I think dealing or writing particularly to this public, to the young public, in pictures and in text is something particularly important, I think. You have actually facilitated a lot of workshops in a lot of different countries, in Mali, in Benin, Chad, Haiti, Mauritius, Guyana, Burundi, Rwanda, and South Africa. You also lived in Paris, Lagos, Mexico City, Nairobi, before you have been living and teaching in Johannesburg from 2007 to 2015. Where you're a professor and head of French and Francophone studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. So this also, I think, is particularly interesting that you link both careers in a certain way, those of the artist and of the academic, which sometimes seem to be lives that don't go really well together. For the last 5 years, if I'm correctly informed, you are based now in London and spend your time between London and Abidjan. It actually started with poetry, even if you were going to read today from your novels, or at least from one of your novels. And maybe what to mention also one very well-known and very important project, which might also be linked to the theme of the Literature Festival. You participated in the writing project Rwanda, écrit par devoir de mémoire, writing as an obligation for memory. Yeah. And after that, you published The Shadow of Imana in 2000, L'Ombre d'Imana, which was a kind of a combination of a travel diary, personal impressions and thoughts, as well as authentic and fictional accounts by killers and victims. Also a very important book, internationally known, and also directly, I think, linked to the subject of today. I found a very nice quotation taken from your novel As the Crow Flies, 2001, which I think could also link in a very different way again to the festival. And let me quote this: "If you want to love, do so to the ends of the earth with no shortcuts. Do so as the crow flies." I found that very particularly beautiful. So let's come to so I think there are a lot of layers and a lot of different lines we could follow today in this discussion that are linked to your work and to your life. In the first version, Véronique suggested to read from 3 different books, and they all link in a certain way, in very different way, to the theme. But in the end, she decided to read a longer passage from her last novel, En compagnie des hommes, in the Company of Men, published in 2017, which deals with the Ebola crisis in West Africa. So in its theme, it's directly linked also to the experience of the corona crisis of our days. And if ever we would have time after this reading and the questions and discussion about this very fantastic novel, I can only recommend this novel. We might, or she might have some time also to read from another novel, Far From My Father, which deals with questions of identity and being in between two cultures and countries, which is also then would speak to another line of this festival. But let's start with the reading In the Company of Men by Véronique Tadjo. Véronique, I'm very happy. I hand over to you, and I will only step in if you need some help, but you don't.
Okay, thank you very much, Ute. I'm very happy to be part of this festival. And yes, I've decided to read longer pieces because I think it's a very important topic, and it links with COVID-19, of course, because we're talking about viruses and the threat to humanity. But what I wanted to do with this book on Ebola was to record what had happened at some point. Not record it as a journalist or a historian, but as a writer. Because I think somehow when I see how things are happening concerning COVID-19, I have this feeling that probably we did not record enough of what had happened during the Ebola crisis, which was a major traumatic period for us in West Africa and in Africa in general. And at some point, it was on the verge of becoming a pandemic. Anyway, I think that, I mean, the subject is still here and there's still a lot of work to do. And I consider the book that I have written as just one contribution in this memorialization of what happened at the time. And for me, it links very much with, of course, the pandemic. So I'm going to read from chapter 4, which is in fact when, well, what is a bit particular about this book is that it is in fact a tree that is recounting what happened during the Ebola crisis, because it's more in the format of a fable. It's a kind of a fable. So you have the environment, you know, trees can talk, the bat can talk, the virus itself can talk, and then you have the human beings that are also giving their testimonies of what happened during the crisis. So it's more a fable, if you want, in that sense. But the chapter I'm going to read from is a doctor speaking. So the title of this chapter is "The Earth is sometimes further from man than the moon. A doctor in a space suit discovers a new universe." The first time I entered the vestibule of the high-risk area, a patient appeared out of the corridor and collapsed right in front of me. He was dripping with blood and other bodily secretions. There must have been millions of Ebola particles all over him. Inside my bulky suit, my heart was beating like a drum. The patient had to be taken back to his bed, so a male nurse and I picked him up by the arms. He was in a state of extreme agitation, shaking uncontrollably. His eyes expressed a deep fear. We had to sedate him. His struggling gradually stopped, and only then were we able to leave him and tend to the other patients. At night, I have nightmares. I dream I'm still among the sick. The tent is a furnace. It's the middle of the day. The sun is beating down on the canvas. I gasp for breath. My head buzzes. I don't have my protective suit on. I'm naked. In fact, and the virus has infected me. My gums are bleeding, my soul leaving my body. I can feel it slipping away through my navel. I wake up in a start. My room bathed in twilight. I can make out the outline of the window against the wall and hear the whirring of the fan. The stilled air is hot, sweat drenches me, my eyelids close heavily. But now it's morning, peeking through the curtains. Another day has begun. I get up, head to the bathroom, splash cool water on my face for a long time, and look at myself in the mirror. I'm alive. It was nothing, just a bad dream. I must ignore it. I must return to the sick. That's where I need to be. In that makeshift health center, there's no more desperate struggle taking place anywhere on earth. Early in the morning, I pass through the entrance reserved for the staff. Most of the others arrive by minibus. They have to get up at the crack of dawn and leave the house while their children are still asleep. My colleagues include the nurses, who are so dedicated, and the psychologists, whose task is not an easy one, and the members of the various teams responsible for water sanitation and the burial of the dead. The cooks arrive as well, and the laundry workers whose jobs are menial but essential. And finally, the administrators and the logisticians, in a hurry to get to their offices at the other end of the center. The volunteers, both local and foreign, feel united in their collective desire to eradicate Ebola. But there are also the other doctors, of course, my closest colleagues. I go inside the tent to attend the morning meeting with the staff members who were on duty during the night. The team leader delivers his report, which includes the number of deaths as well as the number of new admissions. The influx is growing all the time. The head of the ambulance drivers explains that several patients are waiting to be admitted to the center, although there are no available beds. The testing of suspected cases needs to be sped up. The nurse points out that patients who test negative are nevertheless kept at the center so they can get treated for other problems. Would it not be better to transfer them to the main hospital? Someone interjects that the main hospital has been closed since 6 members of their medical staff succumbed to the virus. Next on the agenda are the tasks for the day. A female patient is refusing to eat and take a malaria medication. Only 3 days ago, she lost both her husband and her baby. It's a case that needs to be closely monitored. A young man who was still very communicative on admission started going rapidly downhill and is now completely unresponsive. Several patients are in an advanced stage of the illness and require urgent rehydration. A little girl's arm has swelled up enormously, most probably due to the septicemia. She has received a dose of antibiotics. One of the doctors says that special attention must be paid when giving injections, since the thickness of the gloves makes these procedures risky for both patients and staff. One of the nurses reports that a patient has vomited in the courtyard. A knife has been found under his pillow. He says he'd rather be killed than succumb to Ebola. The team leader wants to know how this knife could possibly have stayed hidden. The nurse doesn't know. The occupant of bed number 6 will be allowed to go home. 5 patients seem to be getting better. I go to the changing room where I'm helped with getting dressed. I pull on my plastic suit. The strong synthetic fabric is thick, waterproof, and sealed at the wrist and ankles. Once my body is safely wrapped, I am given a transparent plastic apron as an additional protective layer. I pull on 2 pairs of gloves, slide my feet into rubber slippers, heavy but comfortable, and easy to put on and take off. In front of the mirror, I check that my face mask is properly in place and my goggles fit tightly. I'm ready. Patients who are already seriously ill are brought in on stretchers. The others walk with difficulty. Their faces are like death masks already. Their eyes bulge. Their bodies are emaciated. Bending over a patient, I'm trying to find a vein. Then the needle prick, and I can insert the catheter. Gently, very gently, for the skin is dry and brittle, and the pulse practically non-existent. I'm focused, working with precision. The gloves are definitely a hindrance. One sudden distraction and the needle may pierce my flesh. Inside my suit, sweat pours from me. I can't talk. My voice is stifled. I gesticulate to the nurse to let her know what to bring me, pointing to the instruments with my fingers. My visor is blurred with condensation. 40 minutes like this, that's the maximum. Any longer and you may faint, you may simply collapse. 40 minutes of inhaling my own breath. Sweat trickles down my arms, my torso and legs. It's boiling hot under the torrid metal roof. The rainy season should have started by now. The rays of the sun seem to be getting more and more intense. I look up, thinking of my wife and children. When will I see them again? Why expose myself to such dangers? Ebola pushes us to our very limits, presses our backs against the wall. I refuse to let the virus win the day. I can't let the disease take control, spread and threaten my family. We must fight it. That's the price we have to pay as long as we share the same planet. The task before us is immense. I'm aware of that. All we can do for our patients is to try to keep them going. There are no effective medicines against the virus. So the main thing is to rehydrate the patients. We give them lots of liquids as often as possible. They also receive nutrition by mouth, but if that doesn't work, they're fed intravenously. Then they get tablets to bring down their temperature, and they're constantly monitored for any signs of problems. We also give them painkillers and try to reduce their anxiety. In their weakened state, such patients easily succumb to secondary illnesses, bacterial infections, malaria, typhoid, tuberculosis. This means we're obliged to go on treating them even if they're already at death's door. We have to do our utmost at all times. Any personal attachment is out of the question. For that would mean making myself susceptible to my patient's suffering, that I wouldn't be able to care for them anymore. All I can really do is carry on with my work, hoping that this horror will soon be over, hoping that the day will come when I can go home to forget and start my life again. But this is incomparably harder when the patient is a child. I remember the baby who came in one afternoon. Her mother was holding her in her arms, tightly wrapped in a blue blanket. Nothing but the tiny face was visible, closed eyelids, a fine layer of soft hair covering the forehead, the lips slightly parted, the skin as flimsy as tissue paper. The woman had to be supported by two male nurses in protective clothing. Since we were obliged to separate the baby girl from her mother, a confirmed case, we took turns feeding the infant with a syringe. Her minuscule body was fighting, resisting. At first, she was digesting the food we gave her and seemed to be gaining strength. But after a few days, she started whimpering. She didn't sleep that night, and the following morning, the milk wouldn't go down. She wouldn't swallow anymore. She vomited. Not long afterwards, she took a deep breath, and then she died. Was there something we could have done to save her? That's the question I've asked myself so often, the question that still obsesses me. The mortality rate among children is devastating, and we have to no separate room for pediatric cases. They are just as contagious as adults, and the same rules apply. Yes, by the time they're dying, they're no longer children. Was there something we could have done to save her? The Ebola Center was put up in haste to enable us to deal with the outbreak quickly. Huge trucks arrived, piled high with wooden planks, metal sheets, and plastic tarpaulins. Then technicians set to work. They built the center, a cluster of prefabricated rooms and tents, and within a few weeks, everything was ready and working. Two generators that operate non-stop provide electricity. The noise they make is an integral part of our working day. The camp is subdivided into two different zones, one zone for suspected cases only, and the other for confirmed cases. On one side of the center, it is reserved for medical staff rooms and offices, unauthorized entry prohibited. In the absence of security guards, an orange plastic ribbon forms a barrier around the center. The entire area is so well lit, one might say it was a prison. The patients inside feel like convicts. The ground all around the place has been bulldozed to create a perimeter that no one approaches without trepidation. Triage takes place under the big tent. Two possible directions: suspected cases and confirmed cases. People waiting for their test results have to stay in the transit zone. They pray, weep, make promises to their God, and remember the important events in their lives. The test results take at least 4 hours to come in, 4 hours followed by a return to normal life or isolation in the treatment zone, which is shut off from the outside world. Formally getting the results took 4 to 5 days. A new mobile laboratory provided by the US Army has shortened the wait. What are we doing here on Earth? Why have we been put here if our existence is nothing but suffering? Some lives seem as worthless and irrelevant as the bruised fruit left over at the end of a market day, left to rot in wooden crates or just thrown away. It's fruit nobody wanted, and yet only a few hours before it was adorning the stones. I am a trespasser in the kingdom of death. This is his private domain, his empire, where he rules with absolute power. I feel like an astronaut floating in space, 1,000 miles from Earth. The slightest tear in his spacesuit and is lost. The slightest tear in mine, and just like him, I'm lost too. Only a few of these patients are going to make it. The rest are never going to leave their beds or the treatment tent. Who will survive? Although they have all received the same level of care, within the span of 2 weeks, one patient is about to pass away while another is getting ready to go home. Another will feel better, get stronger, start to smile again, but then suddenly he'll give up and die. It's impossible to know. Despite all our efforts, all too often, the virus wins. In reality, the final outcome isn't up to us. How hard the sick are able to fight against Ebola depends on the natural defenses they have at their disposal. That is, it depends on their immune system or on the virulence of the virus infecting their organism. Were the survivors in better health than the rest before they became infected? This is something of a mystery. And suppose they recovered simply because their survival instinct was stronger than the disease. The will to survive defeats the virus, it concedes, and they have the freedom to go on living a little longer. None of us knows what we have in our bellies. I myself, though I'm a doctor, have no idea how my body would react if I came down with Ebola. Chances are I wouldn't fare any better than my patients. A woman can survive, an old man can survive, a teenager can survive, and what about me? The virus respects nobody, makes no exceptions. Incapable of rational thought, is the kind of enemy that instinctively wants to crush its opponent. The human race itself wouldn't be enough for it. Even in death, Ebola doesn't want to let go. Like bombs, its corpses sow destruction. At the start of the epidemic, there was the danger that panic might spread. The army had not yet been mobilized. Soldiers were not yet ready to fire on the sick if they tried to escape. But how do you get used to the idea that your body will end up in a plastic bag, doused with disinfectant, and interred in a communal grave by men in masks, buried without any sort of ancestral ritual to prepare the deceased for entry into the next world, and without any kind of funeral to honor their memory? No time for contemplation or human affection. Some people went home in spite of their diagnostic. They absconded with all the consequences doing so entailed, bringing the virus back to their family, to their village, to their town. My shift over, I return to the changing room. This time I get help with the long, complicated process of taking off my protective suit. First, to ensure my boot soles are free of debris or contaminated fluids, I have to step into a container filled with chlorine solution. Then I'm doused with a disinfectant. I cross my arms so that the solution can reach every part of me. Any physical contact is to be avoided. Next, I take the chlorinated shower. All the clothing I've worn must also be washed in chlorinated water and then dried in the sun. What can't be disinfected gets burned. When a patient is allowed to go home, it makes me happy. He or she receives new clothes since everything worn on arrival at the center has been incinerated. The patient is also given some food, vitamins, a small amount of money, and a certificate of good health, which should help with restarting a normal life. When I see a smile on a patient's face, I tell myself that I've done my duty. The things I go through in the Ebola Center are extremely distressing, but I've never known anything more gratifying than alleviating human suffering. My thoughts are with my children and what I'll do and what we'll do when we get together again. I'm going to buy them bicycles, one red, one blue. I'm going to teach them bicycle racing. They'll love that. It will make them happy. All I really want is to spend time with them, to stay home, play in the garden, watch television. I miss their mother. To me, she's the most beautiful woman in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Véronique.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we cannot really show or see clapping, and as there were some comments in the chat room, like very impressed, soul touching. Maybe you have not seen that.
No, I didn't see it. No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I don't know if there are directly some comments or questions. Otherwise, I can also start. But as I have read the novel before, I would leave the floor for others if somebody wants to make comments on that. I can, do you see the others? If you open the chat on the right-hand side, is awesome reading. There was such power in her descriptiveness.
Well, I think that from the comments, I can see, yes, when I was writing the book, my intention was also to give a certain number of information. I thought that it was possible to tell the story, but at the same time to infuse information so that it was grounded in reality. So I did a lot of research, and I must say that I will always be grateful to the journalists, to the researchers, to the witnesses, to all the people who work during that time to put an end to that particular epidemic. But we have to remember that Ebola is still with us because you have outbreaks in the DRC, for example, which are quite regular. And so it's just a lesson for us that very often we equate a virus with a particular place. For example, Ebola was Africa. It seems that COVID-19 is China. But it's a mistake because we see that all these viruses have the power to become pandemics. And then suddenly it's the whole world. You can't put an identity or on a specific country because it becomes suddenly the whole the question for the whole world, for the whole of humanity. So I think that I would be very happy if out of this pandemic, we get a more holistic view of the world. That is, yes, we are a planet floating in the universe and we're all trapped inside or enjoying our life inside. I don't know, but we've got to really see the world as a holistic place.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if there are no direct comments. I cannot see all of the people who are present there. So if someone wants to speak, please just speak up. But what you were just also mentioning, I think, as you mentioned before your reading, it's also the structure of your book is really particularly interesting because there's the baobab, so the tree who's guarding, preserving memory and knowledge, starts the narrative and talks about the relationship between human beings and nature and all the other beings on the world, on the globe. And then different people, different persons speak from their different perspectives. There are the children, there's a doctor, there's the foreign worker who comes to help in the camps. There's a couple and she will not survive and he will be reading poems to her and hoping that she will survive. Children, so very different perspectives. And via these different voices, you bring in all this knowledge as well that you were talking about. But what I found really, so this, because then the baobab will talk again in the end. And the last sentence is, I think, would also then illustrate, unfortunately, I only have the French version, where you said in the baobab saying, and with the last sentence of the novel, le destin des hommes rejoindra le nôtre. So the destiny of human beings will join ours, talking about the difficulties of survival of the globe and all the beings. So this is a reflection in the beginning and also a reflection in the end, and reflects also the cycle of life. And as you said, so yeah, I mean, your book I think it came out in 2017. It reflects on this crisis in 2014. Everything we hear on the press nowadays is something like, okay, we have never seen anything like this before, but it doesn't really link to all these other pandemics, which also shows us or tells us something about, yeah, how different in different parts of the world we see and perceive of what does pen mean, really, englobing and including or everybody. So I think your book particularly also speaks to all these concerns in this multi-perspectivity and the polyphonous structure of your book.
But in fact, I wanted, the baobab just imposed himself, let's say, as the narrator, because first, the baobab is known all over the world, and it's a very respected tree, let's say. But I wanted to also kind of emphasize the fact that we are all connected, all creatures on this earth are connected. And we now know that whatever we do against our environment is going to fire back at us. And therefore, I wanted to kind of bring in this idea that what if the environment, the trees, the animals look at us, look at the way we are living. That would be a very, very different point of view. So it was this idea that although we think we're the masters of the earth, of the universe even, we are also observed by the other creatures of this world, and how we behave also has consequences. But it was this idea of trying to be more humble and bringing in some sort of a conversation between, the environment, the animals, we understand, luckily we understand so much better now what the other creatures of the world mean for us, and how much we must be in connection with them.
Yeah.
I mean, global warming, we know about it now, thankfully. And we also know that pandemics, epidemics have a link with our behavior towards animals, for example. And that it will happen more and more if we don't change, in a way, our way of life.
I don't know if you could just read as you have the English version there, the beginning, just the first two sentences when the virus itself starts speaking. I found it fantastic. I only have the French one.
Okay, I would have to go into my computer. I don't know what to make.
Because there's a long comment by one of the participants, by Diko Mohammed.
Yes.
But just because there's one, the chapter 14 is from the perspective of the voice of Ebola. And it says, d'accord, c'est très beau, c'est très bien. So that's fine, it's very beautiful, but it's not me that people should be afraid of. They should be afraid of themselves. I'm a virus, but I'm millions of years old, and so on and so forth. But then also, like you just said, I mean, pushing it back to, or giving it back the responsibility and also the perspective back to human beings. So please think about yourselves.
Yes,
I
guess it. Yes, I guess it wasn't very kind of me to start talking about how destructive human beings are, as they have been
right.
have been attacked by an epidemic. But the truth is that I wanted to bring out the fact that men can be extremely destructive, not only between themselves. We know about wars, we know about our capacity to endanger other people, but the environment as well. So it's a destructiveness that needs to be controlled if we want to keep on living on this earth.
Okay, I have a lot of other comments, but I see two long comments in the chat. I don't know if you can see it yourself, otherwise I will read it to you. So there's Diko Mohammed, said, thanks a lot for this moving reading, dear Professor Véronique. This story is so real. Were you on the scene of the epidemic, or is it just from research? That's the first question. And the second, there was this comment in my country that Ebola killed more people there, but Corona gets more attention because it affects more powerful part of the globe. So every government needs to show some concern about it. What is your thought about this? Thanks
so
a lot.
It's two questions. It's two questions. Where is this person talking from? Which country is he?
Diko Mohammed, I think he's Diko. I think he's around. Can you show yourself, Diko? I think you're from Mali, right?
Yeah, no, I'm from Nigeria.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nigeria, yes. So in Nigeria, yes, you had you had an Ebola crisis at some point, but people say that the Nigerian authorities actually handled it very well, and in fact it's been when you look at cases of the epidemic, usually Nigeria is named as one of the examples of how to contain a disease, an epidemic. But what I want to say is that no, I wasn't in Guinea, Liberia, or Sierra Leone, for the mere reason that I am not a medical person. So I did not want just to go there and observe and be in between people who were working on the particular epidemic. I had the occasion to go back to Guinea, for example, after the Ebola crisis. So my book comes from the fact that Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, shares the same border with Guinea and Liberia. So we were basically, expecting Ebola to come in anytime. And it was some kind of a miracle that it didn't happen. So I went, for example, to visit an Ebola center that had been built in case Ebola comes in. And it was at the end of one of our big hospitals, the L'Hôpital de Trècheville. And I saw this brand new Ebola center, which luckily did not receive any patient. But next to the center, there was this huge tree, you know, casting its shade on the center. And maybe the idea of baobab came from this site of this huge tree overshadowing the center. And I was thinking, if anything had happened, what would this tree would witnessed? So that's a bit like that. But I totally agree with you that we could have done better in terms of memorializing the Ebola crisis. And yes, I mean, I think we haven't finished seeing what is COVID-19 going to do, because as you can, if you follow the news, you know that the epidemic is flaring up in now more in the global south, like Brazil is in a really, really bad state, and India is really going through a lot, and we're observing what is happening in Africa. Luckily, the numbers are low, so we're praying that it will continue, but everybody needs to continue to be alert. But at the same time, I know that we've learned from the Ebola, past Ebola crisis, but I just think that we could have done better, in particular concerning the health sector. It's incredible to see that in many African countries, and if I'll talk about West Africa, we still have inadequate health capabilities, and that's capacity, that's bad. We should have learned better. We should have done better. Because you don't know how this virus is behaving. In fact, it's completely unpredictable, because who thought that it would be so strong in a place like the United States, for example? So it's very, we have not finished to hear about it. That's what I mean. So we need to learn much faster from our own crises, and then have more solidarity between us, so that we can fight better the challenges that are coming our way.
Thank you. I don't know, Prof. Fendler, can I go again? If there is someone I can keep this.
No, please, you had a second question, go ahead.
Thank you. This is the first time I am having this, like I never read Prof. Véronique, so there is this issue of some questions keep popping up when you are reading, like this woman asking herself, is there anything I could have done? And then, so the question sort of appeals to the inner self, like you feel it's so moving. I don't know why. I mean, is there anything why you decide to choose this form? And then death, when we talk of the meaning of death, at a point death is referred to as he. So I don't know how death becomes he. So what is the, I don't know whether you have some, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good. I'll reply to the last question. It's a good question. It's the issue of translation. Sometimes, you know, like for example, there's a spider in the room, and then for some reason my husband says, "Wow, you know, come and get that spider," and we start talking, and he says he about the spider, and I said, "No, it's a she." For me, spider is a she. It's just translation. Why did they put he for this party, for death? I don't know. For me, death is a she. But then, you know, I think in the context of this book, it had to be personalized. And I think the choice of the translator in this case was to say he, but I understand why you would say why he and not she. But it would have been wrong. You see the problem? This is interesting. Sometimes you come up with interesting questions in translation. But your first question was?
The first question is about this idea, the form you have chosen of this this woman asking herself questions again and again and again.
Oh, yes.
Which can, I mean, they move me, the questions. They are so appealing to so is there anything like particular you decide to take this kind of approach?
Yeah, I tried to put myself in the shoes of a doctor fighting against Ebola, or a nurse fighting against Ebola. And one thing that strikes me is that they fight, they do their best, but sometimes they can't win. It's the virus that wins. And therefore, they must probably always asking themselves questions like, did I do enough? Should I have done this? Should I have done that? And I think it's a profession that is really hard, in the sense that you're faced with a life and death situation. And maybe if you do this instead of that, that's it. The patient might die. So I think it's incredible the type of responsibility they bear on their shoulders. And so I wanted to raise this, and in particular in the context of a child, it's even more heart-rending, you know. Could we have done that? Should we have done this or that? You know, and the thing that is amazing in this period of COVID-19 and with all the past epidemic, Ebola or SARS, is that in fact scientists are struggling with questions all the time, and they're all the time going from one answer trying to get to another answer. But what is sure is that it's not 100% scientific as we think specialty. It has a lot of questions, and most people who have made amazing discoveries have made them because they have continued to ask themselves questions. So I think that's what science is teaching us. Although it can do amazing things, it's a constant questioning process, and it should make us realize that we must not take things for granted. And one thing also is that a lot of time human beings have the answers to their own questions. Like if we take Ebola again, the scientists at some point had to accept the fact that if they did not go to people, if they did not explain to people exactly what the situation was, and according to their own cultural beliefs, they would not succeed. So they had to do a lot of work. And in the book, I talk about a man who is in charge of outreach groups who go to the villages and explain to the villagers, look, this is what the virus is, this is what you can do to help yourself, this and this and this, but always respecting people and their beliefs so that they can collaborate with the scientists.
Okay, there's Xin Li, I think, who wants to ask a question. Please.
Hello, Professor Véronique, Professor Ute Fendler. Thank you. It's just I come from China, and because this COVID-19 situation, I think in February, before it reaches worldwide, and I think, and my cousin, I feel you because it's very touching. It's the kind of heaviness in your heart. And I was in Germany away from home. And then one of my cousins, she is a nurse, and she has not been sent to Wuhan, but the hospital asked them if they're willing to commit to, sign or try to contribute to this, to volunteer to go to Wuhan and to the very heart-stricken region. And she did sign that paper. So it was very soul-reaching, but I feel like there is a mix of despair and kind of hopefulness, right? Because when you talk about when people work in solidarity, but there's also a sense of despair when you talk about how can we do anything to overcome this? Another sense of this is when we think about how worldwide and how the metrics of capitalism, of economical concerns, and of power and of racial difference and all those axes of powers, and they are actually kind of leading this whole situation to a very, very heavy. It makes me feel like how can you really get out of this? There is no justice, and people want their business to be started. More consideration goes to bigger corporations, to people with more privileges, and the role of nurses, the sacrifices of so many, they're underplayed. Nobody is talking about it anymore. So I wanted to ask you, how would you deal with that? And yeah.
Thank you for your question. There is no doubt that it is tough. It's very tough, because if you remember at the beginning of this pandemic, people were saying things like, "Oh, we all in it together. This is almost one world." But very quickly we realized that each country was kind of grappling with its own epidemic, because sometimes I say that a pandemic is an epidemic that has gone abroad, that has crossed borders. But inside one particular country, there's a whole lot of things happening, a whole dynamic that is different from another country. So I think I totally agree with you. Is sometimes you want to despair because there is so much work. But at the same time, I have the feeling that something is happening. Something is happening. Maybe not the way we expected it, but it will be tied with the environmental issue. Because while we are grappling with this pandemic, climate change has not gone away. I mean, all the major issues, the climate injustice, everything is still there. We are just busy with an urgent matter, but these things will come back. And I think that it's only through cooperation that we will be able to solve a problem which is worldwide. So I despair a lot at times, but I think that we have to learn to resist. You should look at yourself as someone who is resists. You have to resist against despair and against the fact that we have other forces coming as obstacles. We just need to not let go of this, because we cannot let go of ourselves, of the future generation, of the present generation, even of the past, because people worked hard to arrive at a certain level. So we cannot lose all that. So we have to be seen as, we have to feel like people who can resist. That's the only way. And I think that everybody can find a way of doing this, so that we can look at the world a bit more as one. And whatever we can do in our own capacity, in my opinion, is very important. One of the reasons, for example, I wrote this book is because we know it today. People who would not even have looked in the streets were people who were the most courageous. You know, for example, you had to find people to bury the dead. Burying the dead is maybe not something you will think about, but it was an extremely dangerous job during the pandemic, during the epidemic, the Ebola epidemic, and even today. I think burying dead people is very dangerous. So these are, people who you don't think of, but sorry, it's my phone going. That's very bad. Sorry, very bad. But these are things that, these are people we must respect enormously.
Thank you very much.
Are there more questions or comments? Otherwise, I could pick up one comment that comes from YouTube. I think it's Ann Adams. I guess it's Professor Ann Adams who makes this comment. Véronique's work brings large-scale African tragedies to the level of individual experience and sensibility. So it's just a comment, but I think this also talks a lot about the quality and the power of literature and arts in general, and why a literature festival or arts festival, even online, is very important at this moment. And maybe I can just say a word about, also to give, that everybody will rush and then once read this book. Because before the Baobab speaks, you have the commencement, the beginning. And then I was really surprised that I expected something else in the beginning of this book, but it then starts with Pars, va-t'en, go away. This is how the book actually starts. A father sending away his daughter so that she might survive because everybody else in the family was already affected. It's a very short paragraph to like a prologue, which will be picked up on later again in the book. But I found this as a picture, like an image in the beginning of this, these different perspectives and narratives about this crisis, particularly strong, and brings us directly into the middle of the human tragedy. So there is solidarity, but solidarity will also bring about that people cannot be together. And then something else that was also striking to me, at least while you were reading, that the image about the doctor, the astronaut that came, popped up several times. And usually when we have astronauts, it's more about, when you say, science fiction, more like a utopian thing. And here it brings us down again, once to the dystopian side of reality, actually, of the present. But at the same time, also the question about, again, about how the human being is then linked to the earth, to the globe, at least to me, in my reading.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I think that we all have that feeling right now with this pandemic. Is sometimes when we sit, or maybe when we're about to sleep, we think, am I dreaming this thing? Is it real? Because I think that it takes you to a different universe, almost to a place where you didn't think you would get one day. And that's why I think that also with the way the doctors and the nurses have to dress, almost, they look like astronauts. They look like astronauts, and when they open the treatment rooms, they enter a different universe. It's like whatever was outside doesn't count anymore. It is just what they have to face, which counts at that very moment. So it gave me this idea of a parallel universe that does not have the rules or the regulations of the world outside. It's a different reality. That's what struck me. And regarding the beginning, I was thinking more like a war situation, when there's a war situation, what do people do? What do parents do? They say, okay, let's find a safe place. You know, we have to find a safe place, and I think it's fundamentally about human nature, and we have to take that into account when we look at events.
But this is also, as you say, it's like war. So we are. I read. So when I started reading, it's about Ebola crisis, and then it starts like you go to. I mean, you get right in the middle of a war narrative, and very often we have these parallels, but they use it in a quite different way. But here, as you say, it's the human. It's more the human side about this experience, about being threatened. That your life is really threatened. So the parallels are there, but sometimes, I mean, in official or media discourses, this when we go, then when they talk about war, it seems it's not really the human side they are talking about.
Yes, yes, but it's more also talking about the survival instinct.
Yeah.
That in us and in this whole pandemic, I think you will have, we have all become survivors until further notice. But that's this yes, this instinct which often makes the difference between two people, unfortunately. But it's not something that we know how to necessarily develop. It looks like there's something of a mystery about how it happens and why we have it or we don't have it, or you know, there's a big mystery. And also what I was saying in the story, whatever is in your body, you are not totally in control of, you're not in control of it. You're trying your best. You're exercising, you're trying to eat if you can as well as possible. But at the end of the day, there's the mechanic within yourself which is going to decide whether the virus will win or not.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I don't know, they said we are 5 minutes late already, but they told me that we could go, that we had a little bit more time. I don't know if there are more questions, otherwise it seems there should be a break with some music. But I wondered if Mr. Reed is still with us, because he made a comment also about your reading, that it was so impressive because of his experience in New York. I don't know if he's still there and would like to make a comment, because what I found really very nice also in this session now, that we had comments from different parts of the world and the different perspectives.
Yes, I am here.
Nice.
Mr. Reed, I am here.
Would you like to make a comment before we have to
Yes.
close?
I mean, definitely in the context of looking at the contrast between, if we're still in the point of Ebola, the passage that was read, right? Mm-hmm. And looking at my experiences here in New York, when you look at a place like New York and you look at the United States and its level of infrastructure, you come to discover that our infrastructure is a lot of like show and tell, like the idea of children bringing in objects of value. But the efficacy, the ability of those children to actually, conduct the apparatus that they bring into the school is like an example of a child who brings their parents' gun to a school and shoots it off. So now that we have a situation that is akin to Ebola, and I'm going to use multiple instances of this, you see that the idea that Americans in particular have about how certain the system is to protect them, it failed them. And one example is the doctor who went right into the middle of Williamsburg, having Ebola, and decided to go and just, bowl like amongst a whole bunch of people. In his mind, it was like, it's not that serious. Even though he was coming from specifically a place that not only did he contract Ebola, but he was a doctor working with Ebola patients, knowing how serious that would be, right? So now he's in New York and he's telling people, you need to be really careful. This is very serious. And I'm like, well, I guess in a way you're the most qualified to do so. On the other end, I mean, I've been a witness to bodies in the street, to bodies on the train. There's so much of what has been going on here that is not really told in a way to sell the United States as we're still chugging along. And it's so against the necessary security, like mentally and physically, for the well-being of the poor. So many Black people at significant risk, you know, just as a matter of statistically in terms of heart disease, because COVID has shown itself to be a disease that very much attacks the heart, right? And whether this is a designer virus or if it's just the luck of, you know, humanity's draw, it's interesting how capitalism is like a cat, you know, who eats its young, you know, because that kitten is not beneficial, you know, to her. And so America seems like this thing that people would love to purr and would love to have in their house. But the moment in which you discover that your cat eats its own child, you're like, I don't know how to deal with that cat, right? So I really appreciated the sense of care that was expressed of the bodies being, you know, buried, and that there was a sense of honor that wasn't just a matter of celebratory, but that was like humane, African humanity, you know? And it's so interesting here in the United States where, again, you see bodies on the floor at a funeral home, right? And you could say, listen, there's bodies to be found, you know, on the floor in a country that's lacking infrastructure. But again, it's like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, right? You know, so I really enjoyed your reading. I actually have been live tweeting about your reading on Twitter. So you'll see at least one post about your reading.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, merci beaucoup.
We need to know more about what's happening on the ground, really, you know, and what you're going through in the States. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Also from, let's say, from your report from the US. I think, yeah, thank you very much for your reading, Véronique. Okay. Unfortunately, now we had just had one chapter and not more.
No, you could see it was long. I couldn't evaluate the length, so it was. I'm glad to have been able to answer the questions. I think it's very
important. That was very important. But then I just recommend if I have a look at all the other books that are all fantastic, and also the paintings and the books for children, and there's a lot to discover if you haven't met her before and if you haven't read her work. But I'm also very grateful for all the comments and that they came from so different perspectives, because I think as it is, as we have seen also in your book, then a very global issue. Even the discussion was quite global, and I think this gave us at least kind of a feeling of being together and learning together, which was also then one of the objectives of this getting together here, on, even if it's only online. So I would like to thank you that you have accepted to participate here, as it's also kind of an adventure for all of us today, but it works out quite well. Thank you very much. And I see that Katharina Fink wants to make an announcement, I think, about some music that we can listen to now before we continue in the program. Véronique, and then we will see how we about other activities later on.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you.